History remembers kings and battles, the births, not so much. No monuments for the women who sat through blood and prayers, who tied knots and whispered blessings, who boiled linens before boiling was science. No headlines for the ones who stayed awake as others screamed and tore and came into the world fists first. The midwife was not royalty, but she was needed. Fiercely, reluctantly, sometimes secretly. She was the keeper of doors between womb and world, between life and whatever waited past it. She knew things that others preferred not to name. Herbs that stopped pain, herbs that stopped bleeding, herbs that stopped life. She lived in the middle of everything and belonged to no one. Trusted just enough to be useful, feared just enough to be alone. And so we begin, not in a palace or battlefield, but in the low-timbered cottage of a woman whose name wasn't recorded. Because why would it be? Let's step inside. Chapter 1. Dawn over the timbered cottage. It begins before sunrise, as most things do in the 14th century. Not because it's poetic, but because the roof leaks, and the draft through the door has more motivation than the fire. The cottage is small, crouched low under the slope of its thatched roof. From outside, it looks like it might sink into the earth any year now. From inside, it already has. In the main room, the hearth glows faintly, just enough to throw shadows across the hanging herbs. Bundles of sage, rue and tansy sway slightly in the cold air, their stems stiff with drying. On a low shelf, jars rest in rows. Beeswax, elderflower, honey, vinegar, fat scraped from lamb bones, powders that look like dirt but cost more than meat. There's no glamour here, no white linens, no soft lighting. The floor is packed earth, swept regularly but always dusted with ash and straw. A wooden table stands uneven near the window. Beside it, a low stool, a basin, a wrapped bundle of cloths, some stained, some still clean, and in the corner a birthing stool with a chipped leg, mended 3 times, still functional. The woman who lives here wakes before the cock crows, not by choice. Her joints do that for her. Knees that once knelt beside dozens, maybe hundreds of birthing women now complain before she even swings them over the side of her straw mattress. Her hands, though, those still move well enough, still strong, still steady. She is not young, but she's not old either, not really, 40 maybe, which in this time and place might as well be ancient, especially for a woman who's seen so many children born and so few survive the year. She sits at the edge of the bed, rubbing her arms for warmth. The wool blanket clings to her skin, rough from years of washing, soaking, drying by firelight. She pulls on her oversmock, thick linen, stiff with use. She ties her apron at the waist, not for baking, but because she expects blood by the end of the day. Today is a birthday. She's known it's coming for a week. The mother, a miller's wife, has been walking like she's balancing a barrel under her tunic. The baby is late. That's not unusual. What's unusual is that this one might be the 8th child the woman carries. 4 buried already, 2 barely walking, 1 who won't stop coughing. The odds are not generous. The midwife sets water to warm in a clay pot by the hearth. Not boiling, never boiling. Scalded skin does not welcome life well. Beside it she adds herbs to steep. Pennyroyal for scent, raspberry leaf for strength. A pinch of ground fenugreek because it couldn't hurt. The smell rises slowly, earthy, bitter, oddly comforting. She checks her pouch. A small leather roll. Inside, a curved knife, dull from caution. A thin cord of flax. A wooden spoon. A dried sprig of yarrow. 2 coins wrapped in linen. For what? No one says aloud, but they're always there. She steps outside. The world is still grey. Mist clings to the ground like it's not ready to let go. Somewhere a sheep complains. A dog barks once, then remembers it's cold, and stops. Smoke curls from 1 or 2 chimneys. Most houses are still dark. The road is mud. Always mud. Even in spring, even in sun. She walks carefully, skirt hitched, feet placed where the ruts are shallowest. She's done this walk 100 times. Through rain, snow, births, miscarriages, stillbirths. Through nights when wolves howled too close, and mornings when no one answered her knock. She reaches the miller's home just as the first light rises, enough to colour the window panes. It's a bigger house than hers, but colder inside. Always is. Wealth doesn't always buy warmth. The miller is waiting, not for the baby, but for the midwife. His face is pale, his hands stained with flour. He doesn't look her in the eye. Most men don't. Not when she's here for this. He says nothing, just nods toward the upper room. The wife lies on a low pallet. Her face is drawn, sweat beads on her upper lip. The room smells of fear and sour breath. The fire is low. The midwife moves to it first, building it back up. Heat matters more than anything. Cold kills quicker than blood loss. She kneels by the woman, sets down her bag, listens, not with a stethoscope, with hands, with eyes, with instinct. She presses gently on the belly, feels for position, listens to the breathing, watches how the woman grips the blanket. Short breaths, shallow, not ready yet. The birthing stool is placed, linen is laid, water is poured, prayers are murmured, not loudly, not to saints, just to the air, to the bones of the house, to the ghosts that might be listening. The mother moans softly, then louder. The midwife holds her hand, not to comfort, but to check for tremors. Shock is quiet at first. Time stretches, hours slip. The room dims and brightens again as the clouds move overhead. No clocks, just pain, rest, push, breathe, the cycle of birth, and finally, a sound, not the cry of a child, but the cry of the mother. Then the head, then the shoulders, then the child, slick, purple, furious at the cold. The cord is cut, tied, the baby wrapped in soft wool and pressed to the mother's chest. The midwife checks for bleeding. There's too much. She presses down hard. The mother winces, but it slows, just enough. The room is silent now, but heavy with breath. The miller knocks softly. The midwife doesn't answer. Not yet. She wraps the afterbirthing cloth, places it by the fire, cleans her hands with vinegar and a rag. Only then does she open the door. It's a boy, she says, as if that matters more than the fact that they're both alive. She leaves without waiting for thanks. There rarely is any. She walks back through the grey. Her feet ache. Her back protests. But her hands are steady. That's what counts. In the village, children are beginning to run down the lanes. A rooster crows late. Someone is already yelling about eggs. The sun finally rises above the trees. The midwife opens her door, peels off her apron, and sits. Not to rest, to prepare. There's another one due in 3 days, maybe sooner, and the next birth could be easier, or worse. She's learned not to guess, just to be ready. The hands of a midwife don't begin as steady. They shake, they flinch, they fumble herbs, knot cords too loosely, press too hard or not hard enough. No one is born knowing how to help someone else be born. The skill is taught, in fragments, across years, through mistakes, rituals, repetition, and silence. There are no formal schools, no neat certificates, no grand oaths before the church or crown. Midwifery in the Middle Ages is learned the way most womanly work is learned, by watching, doing, and being trusted not to speak of what should be kept quiet. The cottage walls remember more than the women do. Generations have passed through the same doorway, learning by the dim light of the hearth and the glint of sweat on a labouring woman's brow. In this world, apprenticeship is not a classroom, it's a shared basin, a mop bucket. A late-night knock at the door followed by a whispered come. She's started. It's the soft rustle of skirts, the scent of old linens, the weight of your teacher's eyes watching how you set the stool or check the pulse. If you ask the midwife how she learned, she might shrug, or she might nod toward the box under her bed. It doesn't look like much. Wood warped by time, one corner darkened by mildew, another chipped by the heel of a boot. But inside is everything, the physical inheritance of her profession. Not gold, not scripture, but a spoon, curved by use, a scrap of parchment inked with herbal measurements, a cloth stained with something older than memory, a comb, a stone, a vial of crushed myrrh, heirlooms, tools, yes, but more than that, each with a story, each handed down not just for function, but as a quiet assurance, you are part of something older than yourself. The spoon belonged to her teacher, bent from years of mixing pastes and stirring broths. It still smells faintly of honey and wormwood. It's not special to look at. The bowl is shallow, the handle worn smooth. But it's the same one used in dozens of births. The same one that stirred porridge for exhausted mothers and salves for cracked skin. In a way, it's more intimate than a cross. The comb is carved from bone, not local. Someone once said it came from across the sea, perhaps Moorish or Roman before that. It doesn't matter. What matters is what it was used for, to clean the hair of mothers after birth. It was believed that tangled hair kept the soul from settling after labour, so they combed, gently, always from the crown outward, always after the bleeding had stopped, or when it didn't. The stone is the most curious item, flat, palm-sized, cool, even by the fire. Some say it's a charm, others a tool to press against the belly when cramping was severe. Her teacher used to place it in water, whisper over it, then lay it beneath the bed of a woman in labour. No one explained why. It wasn't for her to ask, it was for her to do. That's how midwives teach, not with lessons, but with example. The apprenticeship starts long before anyone calls it that. She was 12 when she first followed the older woman on a call. It was raining. It always is in memory. The house smelled like mould and vinegar. A first birth, a hard one. She was told to boil water, keep the fire going, and not speak unless asked. She remembers standing in the corner, arms wrapped tight around herself, watching the older midwife kneel between the mother's legs. No panic, no prayer, just motion, practiced, firm, unshaken by the screaming. When it was done, the baby was blue, silent. The cord had tangled. The old midwife didn't cry out. She bit her lip, cleared the mucus, blew air gently between tiny lips, then pressed on the chest with 2 fingers, again, until a sound came, not strong, but enough. Later, when the room was quiet and the mother slept, she asked if the child would live. Maybe, the midwife said, but at least he started. It was not comfort, it was fact. That was the first lesson. Life is never promised, but effort must be, every time. Her own apprenticeship continued like that, informally, relentlessly, scrubbing cloths stained with birth blood, measuring out rue by scent when eyes burned from the smoke, holding down limbs when seizures came, fetching the priest when they knew it was too late, but brought him anyway. There was no badge of honour, no ceremony. Just one day, a year or 2 later, the old midwife looked at her and said, "You'll go to the Lenten girl. It's time," and that was it. She became a midwife not by study, but by standing in a room no one else wanted to enter, and knowing what to do. Each teacher leaves something, not always an object, sometimes just a phrase. Her teacher used to say, "Never trust a man with clean hands or a woman who won't look at blood." It stuck, and in time, she passed her own sayings down. To the girl who now swept her hearth, watched her grind herbs, sat too long by the fire pretending not to listen. The girl was maybe 11, sharp-eyed, thin as a ribbon, not related, not formally adopted, but drawn in all the same. She didn't announce the apprenticeship, just started giving the girl tasks. "Stir this, don't burn it. Feel this leaf, see how it crumbles too easily. That's old stock. Toss it. Hold her leg while I tie this. Speak low, lower, that's better." The girl stayed, through illness, through silence, through 3 births in a single week when the midwife thought her back might finally betray her. The girl stayed, watched, helped, learned. Sometimes failed, once vomited at the sight of a torn perineum. That was normal. The midwife just handed her a rag and said, "Better now than later." That too was part of the tradition. Because midwifery wasn't just skill, it was resilience, patience, the ability to keep moving while others wept, to think while others screamed, to hold steady in rooms where death and life both pressed close against the skin. Some nights the old midwife sat with the girl and opened the wooden box, not for ceremony, just to show. "This was my teacher's," she'd say, handing over the spoon. She could stop a hemorrhage with just this in 3 fingers. This charm, don't laugh, was buried in salt during the plague, said it spared the mother when the child was lost. And finally, wrapped in a cloth at the bottom, a book. Small, hand-bound, written in cramped Latin and worse French. The Secrets of Women. Not a church-approved text. Not really approved by anyone, but passed along, copied from a copy of a copy. It contained diagrams, notes, recipes, theories that made priests nervous and some physicians jealous. "This," she said, "you don't show anyone, but you read it, until the pages wear thin." The girl's eyes lit up like candles. The midwife said nothing else. She didn't have to. The box had spoken. Heirlooms are not about wealth, they're about weight. Weight of memory, of blood, of responsibility. When the old midwife dies, there is no eulogy, no gravestone, just a wrapped bundle passed to another woman's hands. The spoon, the comb, the stone, the book, and the understanding that this is not a gift, it is a burden, lovingly carried. In the world of the medieval midwife, most names fade. They dissolve into parish records, margins of ledgers, whispered tales passed down with half-remembered herbs and contradictory recipes. But one name lingered, spoken softly, sometimes reverently. Trotula. No one knew if she was real. That part hardly mattered, because whether she was a single woman, a group of writers, a physician's widow, or a literary construction stitched together by scholars, she existed in shadow, and the shadow was enough. The midwife had heard the name first as a girl, muttered by her teacher with a curl of the lip and a glint in her eye. Not scorn, not worship, something in between, a kind of grim respect. She wrote it down, the woman had said. All of it. The blood, the milk, the shame. even the tears. Then, with a scoff, not that the physicians care, Trotula was said to be a healer from Salerno, a city that shimmered in memory like a mirage. Far from mud-thick villages and ash-caked hearths, Salerno had schools, libraries, physicians in robes instead of rags. And somewhere among them, a woman, or the ghost of one who had the audacity to write about women's bodies as if they mattered. De passionibus mulierum, ante et postpartum, on the sufferings of women before and after birth. It was not a holy text. It did not save souls, but it saved lives, or at least tried to. The midwife had seen a copy, once, not hers, not her teacher's. It belonged to a travelling herbalist, a thick-fingered man who sold dried bladderwort and powdered hare's foot from a cart that smelled like vinegar and neglect. He had the book wrapped in oilskin, hidden beneath sacks of nettle. When she asked to see it, he hesitated, then handed it over with a look that suggested either generosity or boredom. The Latin was dense, ink faded, margins cramped with corrections, but the contents, they were like reading a map of her own work, only with clarity she hadn't dared expect. It named things, not in metaphor or superstition, but in description. The womb was not a vessel of mystery, but an organ with tissue, pressure, rhythm. The afterbirth was not just something to bury before the devil smelled it. It was a biological event with cause and complication. Milk was examined, purgatives described, even sutures mentioned, albeit cautiously. The book described when to use heat, when to bleed, when to wait, when to pray, not as opposites, but as tools, side by side. Some of it contradicted what she'd been taught. Her teacher had said to always warm the stones before placing them under the cot. Trotula said cold compresses were sometimes better, especially when swelling would not go down. Her teacher believed the afterbirth would not come unless the woman was given a piece of iron to grip. Trotula suggested pennyroyal steam and light pressing on the abdomen. The midwife did not reject one for the other. She held both, weighed them, tried, observed, adjusted, because to do otherwise would be to ignore what she saw with her own eyes. And still, the name carried danger, because Trotula's work lived in that grey zone, too learned for women, too female for men. The physicians of Paris and Bologna scorned it. Even as they copied it, clerics rolled their eyes or declared it heretical, depending on the audience. But in kitchens, in back rooms, in low cottages with boiling pots and quiet screams, the book survived, passed from one hand to another, smuggled, hidden, whispered. She never owned a copy. Too expensive, too risky. But she copied pages, by firelight, onto scraped parchment made from the margins of old rent rolls. She didn't copy everything, just the parts that mattered. A section on obstructed labour, a recipe for balm, made with goose fat and chamomile, instructions on how to comfort a woman who couldn't stop bleeding, and perhaps most precious of all, the advice that if nothing worked, if the child died or the mother slipped away, the midwife must not blame herself, only try again, better, calmer, wiser. If she lived that long, that line she remembered by heart. Trotula's ghost lived in her cottage, though she never said so aloud. It was there in how she organised her herbs, not alphabetically, but by use. It was in the way she asked questions, even when others frowned. It was in how she trained the girl, not just with rituals, but with reason. Don't just do it, she'd say. Know why. Because she said so wasn't enough. Neither was because I said so. Not anymore. But not all were pleased. Some of the village women whispered, "She reads too much. She waits too long before calling the priest. She thinks she knows more than the saints." The priest himself had questioned her once, after a death, a mother who bled too fast, too hard. He asked if she had prayed. She said yes, of course. He asked if she had used powders not approved by the bishopric. She said no. He didn't believe her, but she continued, because women still came, and when they came in secret, some with shame, some with fear, some with empty bellies and bruised arms, desperate not to birth what had been forced upon them. She never turned them away, but she never spoke of it either, because to name such work was to invite fire. Still, the shadow of Trotula gave her strength, not because she worshipped her, but because someone, somewhere, had dared to name the same truths she lived, the truth that women suffered in patterns, that pain was not always punishment, that healing was not the exclusive province of those with crosses or crests. Trotula's name was rarely written in church records, but midwives carved it into their methods, into their rituals, into their survival. Sometimes, when the girl slept, the midwife sat by the fire and reread the scraps she had copied. She didn't understand every word. Some terms were beyond her, but she understood the spirit. Not all shadows are ominous. Some are shelter. That winter, the The girl asked about the birthing stool, why it had holes, why it curved, why it was never cleaned with vinegar like the basins were. The midwife smiled. "That's not just a stool," she said. "It's a memory, a method, a mystery." Then added, "We'll speak of it tomorrow, at dawn. Bring the linseed oil." Because next came the tool itself, wood, sweat-polished and worn smooth by generations of thighs, stained in ways no scrubbing could fix, and shaped by more than hands, shaped by need, shaped by risk, shaped by what Trotula might have called the wisdom of the living body. And so we move forward, not by forgetting the past, but by sitting where others sat, listening to the echoes, and whispering their names, even when no one else will. If the hearth was the heart of a medieval home, then the birthing stool was the quiet altar of the midwife's world. It did not look like much. A short wooden frame with 3 legs, sometimes 4, if the carpenter didn't trust balance, and a wide oval opening in the middle, sturdy, stained, awkward to store. The kind of thing most people mistook for a broken chair, until they saw it in use. To the untrained eye, it was just furniture. To the midwife, it was a tool, a symbol, a stage for life to stagger in, screaming and blood-soaked, gasping its first breath. She kept it in the far corner of the cottage, behind a stack of folded linens and dried thistles. Not hidden exactly, just quiet. You didn't parade it around like a relic. You brought it forward when needed, and then you cleaned it. Not with vinegar or soap, but with linen and warm water and something close to reverence, because it had secrets, not the kind carved in words, but the kind pressed into wood grain, the kind you felt in your back when you lifted it one too many times, or in your knees when you knelt before it for hours. The stool predated her, that much was certain. The legs were smoothed by time, edges rounded not by design but by friction. The central hole, wider at the back, shallower at the front, bore the unmistakable wear of generations. She'd once pried open a seam and found a pin tucked inside the frame, rusted nearly to powder. No one could explain why it was there. It just was, and now it remained. The stool had belonged to her teacher before her, and her teacher's teacher, and supposedly the woman before that, though no one remembered her name. Only that she had delivered 13 babies during one winter outbreak of sweating sickness, and survived. That was legacy enough. Apprenticeship did not end with knowledge, it continued with objects, and the birthing stool was the most personal of them all. More than the herbs, more than the cord-cutting knife, because it bore witness. The midwife remembered the first time she used it alone. It was not dramatic, not a crisis, just a quiet birth in a woodcutter's cottage, 2 miles past the river bend. The mother was older, 30, maybe, and this was her 6th child. She knew what to expect. The pain didn't frighten her. The silence did. Her husband had died the year before. This was the last child and everyone knew it. When the contractions started, the woman didn't scream. She bit her lip. She walked. She bled. She sat. And when it was time, she took the stool without flinching. The midwife adjusted the linens, placed the warm cloth against the small of her back, pressed gently as she'd been taught. She reached beneath, cradled the head as it emerged, slow, hesitant. Then all at once, a girl. The mother didn't speak. She only held the child to her chest and closed her eyes. Later, the midwife washed the stool, slowly, reverently. The blood had already dried along one edge. A little had soaked into the grain. She did not scrub that part. Some stains were meant to stay. The stool was shaped for practical reasons. It allowed gravity to help. It gave the mother stability. It let the midwife work from below, eyes clear, hands free. But there were other reasons too. Reasons no physician talked about. Because physicians didn't sit on birthing stools. They didn't squat in rush-strewn cottages beside women who were barely more than girls, who screamed the names of long-dead mothers as they pushed life into the world. The stool let the woman face forward, let her hold someone's hands, let her feel less like a patient and more like a force. Even so, there was discomfort in its presence. Some priests disapproved. They preferred women give birth lying down, silent, modest, flat on their backs, eyes to the heavens, as if waiting for salvation rather than midwives. But lying down made things harder, slower, more dangerous. The stool resisted that narrative. It was a tool of women, passed from woman to woman, shaped by need, not doctrine. In some places they burned them. When midwives were accused of witchcraft, of pride, of causing deaths with curses instead of saving lives with skill, sometimes their birthing stools were dragged to the village square and thrown on the pyre with them. Other times the stool survived, but the woman did not. There was a dent in the underside of hers, a small gouge. You wouldn't notice it unless you turned the stool upside down, which no one did unless they were cleaning it properly. She'd once asked her teacher about it. The woman just said, "That's from Margaret. She struck it with a skillet when her husband tried to drag her off it mid-birth." Then she smiled. She finished the labour. The boy was born strong. That was all. No sermon, no joke, just fact. The stool held those stories. They weren't written anywhere. You wouldn't find them in the parish rolls or monastic libraries, but they were real. The girl asked once if they should sand the surface smooth. "It's splintering," she said, running a finger along one edge. "We could polish it." The midwife shook her head. "No," she said, "let it hold." "What?" "Let it hold what it's seen." The girl didn't ask again. She oiled the wood instead, carefully. Every few weeks a cloth soaked in linseed, rubbed until the surface shone like old amber, until the grain drank it in. It wasn't just a stool, it was a memory, a method, a mystery, and like all sacred tools, it had rules. Never leave it outside overnight. Never lend it to a woman who has not bled this year. Never clean it with salt water unless someone has died on it. And always, always, speak softly when it's in use. Not for the woman, for the child. For what listens when the veil is thin. Because birth was not just blood and breath, it was a crossing, and the stool was the bridge. The day came, years later, when the girl, no longer a girl, delivered her first child alone. The midwife was ill, feverish, unable to rise. The girl took the stool herself, packed her bag, tied the apron, walked out at dawn. She returned at dusk, face pale, hands stained, eyes unreadable. "She's alive," she said. "So is the child." Then she sat down and didn't speak for an hour. The stool stood beside her, blood still drying along the inner rim. No celebration, no wine, just breath and silence, and the quiet, undeniable beginning of something irreversible. After that it belonged to both of them, not jointly, not legally, but in the way traditions pass, through use, through wear, through sweat, through the shared knowledge that this object, low and simple as it seemed, had helped more people survive than any sword or crown ever had. It was not sacred, but it was not ordinary either. It was exactly what it needed to be, and when the midwife finally died, quietly as she had lived, with a rag over her forehead and the sound of rain on the thatch, the stool remained, not in a corner, not hidden, but in the centre of the room, oiled, upright, waiting, because soon someone else would come, knocking, bleeding, breathing, ready, and the stool would be ready too. The village slept in uneven rhythms. Cattle shifted in their pens. Dogs muttered in their dreams. A child somewhere coughed once, then twice, and fell quiet again. But in the midwife's cottage no one slept. The hearth still glowed, banked low with coals. On the table a mortar, a pestle, and a mess of stems that had not yet been sorted by hand or memory. The room smelled of crushed mint, old chamomile, and a sharper scent, wormwood maybe, or yarrow gone bitter in the jar. Midnight was not a peaceful hour here. It was when the work began, because that was the nature of herbs. They didn't wait for daylight. Some needed to be picked by moonlight. Others lost their strength in the sun. A few, if you believed the old stories, only gave up their power if they were gathered without being looked at directly. Superstition, perhaps. But in midwifery, superstition was just another form of caution. The girl stood barefoot near the table, stripping leaves from a stalk of feverfew. Her fingers moved quickly, without hesitation. Beside her, the midwife, older now, slower, ground dried juniper berries into powder. The rhythmic scraping of stone against stone filled the room. They were preparing for a birth that hadn't started yet, but it would. The signs were there. The woman's back pain, the slow, regular pulse, the way she winced when standing. Another day, maybe two. Preparation wasn't optional. Not here. Not for them. Because once labour began, there would be no time to measure, no chance to find the good honey, the sharp knife, the unspoiled cloth. You prepared now, or you failed later. And failure didn't always mean death. Sometimes it meant paralysis. Sometimes it meant the mother lived, but the child did not. Sometimes it meant both survived, but neither could look at you the same again. So they worked. The midwife muttered ratios to herself. 1 part crushed rosehip for the tea, 2 parts dried nettle to strengthen the blood, a pinch of valerian root, but no more. Too much and the mother would sleep too deeply to push. 3 dried cloves, not for healing, but for scent. The girl's idea, something to ground them when the sweat and panic rose. On a nearby shelf sat the oil jars, each labelled not with words. Many midwives couldn't read, but with scratches, knots and symbols. A circle for calming, a cross for cleansing, a spiral for the one they never spoke of directly. Those oils were stronger, meant for the last resort. The midwife had used one only twice in her life. A thick, pungent blend of mugwort, rue, and a touch of foxglove. Not enough to kill, but enough to slow the bleeding. If you got the dose right, if you didn't, well, she didn't finish that thought. The girl stirred honey into a warming bowl of water. Not too hot, not too fast. Honey had to melt slowly, or it crystallized on the bottom. They would dip cloth into it later, fold it into compresses, for tearing, for tenderness. They had no alcohol. Not the good kind, anyway. Wine was too expensive. Spirits were for priests or landlords. So they used what they had, vinegar infused with rosemary, kept tightly corked in the back corner. It stung, but it cleaned, and that was enough. Outside, an owl called. The girl looked up, then back down at the drying herbs on the windowsill. "I never hear them in summer," she said. "No," the midwife replied. "They prefer the quiet." She didn't explain what she meant. The girl would understand in time. Certain nights, especially the cold ones, held a kind of hush that even the animals obeyed, a kind of stillness that asked for respect, that told you not to waste time, not to spill herbs, not to speak lightly of the work you did, because this wasn't kitchen medicine, this wasn't church-sanctioned tending of the sick, this was something older, rawer, closer to the skin. The herbs in their baskets weren't just ingredients, they were history, memory, echoes of the women who came before, tansy for bleeding, marshmallow root for swelling, bay leaf to calm the heart, fennel to ease the wind in the child's belly. Each had its use, each had its cost. The girl reached for a bundle of lavender, only to pull back with a hiss, a splinter, deep beneath her nail. The midwife took her hand, examined it. "Don't pull it," she said. She turned, found a thin needle from the sewing box, and tapped it lightly against the firestone. Then she coaxed the sliver free in a single motion. "Your hands are your tools," she said. "Treat them better than your thoughts." The girl nodded, silent, embarrassed, grateful. They returned to their work. On the wall hung an old bundle, a charm, if you asked the neighbours. Twisted grass, red thread, a small pouch of crushed sage. Not for sale, not for healing, just for watching. The midwife didn't believe in all the old magic, but she didn't disbelieve either. Some things worked even when no one understood why, and in childbirth, results were what mattered. They made a poultice for the compresses, a slow mash of calendula and goose fat, stirred into linen and set near the fire to steep. The fat had to be rendered in spring, from a goose killed under a waxing moon. That was what her teacher always said. The girl had asked once why that mattered. The midwife had shrugged. "It probably doesn't," she'd said, but she was never wrong when she used it. There were worse reasons to follow a tradition. They filled 2 small pouches with dry herbs, one for the woman to hold, one for the midwife to crush under her nose if the air turned too heavy. They dampened the reed mats beneath the window to keep the dust down. They laid out fresh linens, folded corner to corner, as if that mattered. It did. It always did. Every motion had meaning, even if no one spoke it. By the time they finished, the fire was low again, the girl's eyes heavy. But the midwife was still awake. She held a jar to the light. Inside, a tincture, dark as ink, angelica root and elderbark, for fever when it came. Not if, when. She turned to the girl. "Tomorrow," she said, "we rest while we can." The girl nodded, unsure if it was an order or a mercy. "Then," the midwife added, "we go to her." And just like that, the night ended. Not with sleep, not with peace, but with readiness. Before there was medicine, there was belief. Before there were powders, stitches, clamps, there were knots, whispers, and string wound. 3 times around the wrist. Midwives knew both worlds. They had to. You couldn't survive on knowledge alone. Not in a village where the priest spoke louder than your results and every failed birth was blamed on a curse, a stare, or a sin you didn't confess fast enough. So you learned to speak the language of fear. You learned to fold your skill into signs people trusted. The charm above the door, the prayer mumbled into water, the ash smudged on the soles of a newborn's feet to confuse the devil. The midwife didn't believe in all of it. Not really, but she carried a pouch of charms anyway, and she used them, not for herself, but for the mothers. Because sometimes a woman in pain didn't need logic. She needed to believe she wasn't alone, that something, anything was helping. So the midwife whispered the old words, quietly, rhythmically, not because she thought the herbs would fail, but because the whisper made the fear slow down, made the breathing deepen, made the labour last just long enough to work. The girl had asked once, after a long night where they used every remedy they had, and still the mother bled far too much, if the charms helped. The midwife answered the only way she could. They don't hurt. The pouch she carried was older than her apprenticeship. Its seams frayed, the leather gone soft with use. Inside were bits and pieces that had no place in medical texts but lived in memory anyway. A twist of red wool, for protection. A bent nail, found, not forged, must always be found. A bead shaped like an eye, to ward off envy. A dried sprig of rowan, because her teacher swore by it, and that was reason enough. Each had a purpose, or had once. There was also a ribbon, blue, stained. It had been tied around a woman's thigh during a breech birth. The ends knotted while 3 women prayed. The child survived, the mother didn't. The ribbon remained. Some nights the midwife took it out and ran it through her fingers as if the fabric could still hum with memory. The village women brought charms of their own, sometimes small bundles wrapped in cloth, filled with dried beans, salt or hair, sometimes carvings, a spoon etched with the child's initials, meant to be buried beneath the threshold before labour began. Sometimes just a stone, smooth and cool, held tight in the mother's palm, and believed to draw the pain downward into the earth. It wasn't her place to judge them, not out loud. Privately, she tested every charm against one question. Did it help her listen to the mother? Did it help the mother listen to herself? If the answer was yes, she let it stay. If the answer was no, if it caused harm, panic, delay, she found a reason to set it aside. But even she had her superstitions. Unspoken. Ingrained. She never counted contractions out loud. She never whistled inside a house where someone laboured. She never left scissors open. And she never ever used the same cord twice. These weren't medical rules. They were rituals, and ritual had power. There were words too, not prayers exactly, but not nonsense either. Whispers that passed from midwife to midwife like heirlooms. One for easing pain, in with the breath, out with the burden. One for slowing a labour that moved too fast. Wait, child, the door is not yet open. One for stillbirths, whispered not to the mother, but to the air. Return if you will, rest if you must. The midwife said she didn't remember where she learnt them. They just arrived, in time. The girl learnt them too, not by asking, but by listening. She heard them repeated at the edge of hearing, just loud enough to blend into the rhythm of a heartbeat, or the hiss of water cooling on cloth. She didn't repeat them, not at first, but in her second solo birth, when the mother sobbed and the child crowned too slowly, she found the words rising from her throat like they had always been there. They worked, or they didn't. But the mother survived, and the girl believed, which, some nights, was all that mattered. Charms had their place, but so did consequences. Not everyone approved. The priest tolerated the midwife, but only just. He believed in penance, not poultices. He had once demanded to see the herbs she carried. When she refused, he called them witchcraft. She said nothing. Later, she left a bundle of mint on his doorstep. He never mentioned it again. But in other villages, things didn't end with silence. Some midwives had been accused of sorcery, of stealing infants' souls, of causing miscarriages with words spoken under breath. The line between healer and heretic was thin, often drawn by men who knew neither pain nor patience. That's why midwives worked in shadows, in whispers, behind curtains and under moonlight. To be seen too clearly was to invite danger, and so the charms remained discreet, tucked into hems, hidden in sleeves, worn beneath tunics on leather strings. They weren't always ancient. Some were invented on the spot. A button from a father's coat, sewn into a birthing pillow. A scrap from the mother's wedding shift, tied around her wrist. A lullaby, half remembered, sung over the water basin before washing the child. These too were charms, not by design, but by function. They tethered the mother to the world, to memory, to purpose, and sometimes that was stronger than medicine. The midwife had one charm she never explained. A lump of beeswax, moulded in the shape of a closed fist. She kept it above the hearth, wrapped in cloth, never touching it unless the birth turned. When asked what it was for, she only said, to remind us to hold on. No one knew whether she meant the baby, the mother, or herself. Maybe all three. The girl found her own charms, a shell, a scrap of ribbon, a bead from her first birth. She didn't talk about them, but she carried them in a pouch like her teacher did, and when her hands trembled, she touched them. Just for a moment. Charms didn't guarantee success, but they gave shape to the chaos. A thread, a sound, a weight. Something to reach for when the screaming started, and all you could do was wait. At the next birth, the midwife placed a carved figure on the windowsill. A little wooden woman with her hands on her belly, eyes closed. The mother asked what it was. For company, the midwife said. Does it help? She smiled. Sometimes. Later, when the child was born, the mother asked to hold it. She did, and wept. Not for the figure, but for what it meant. That someone, somewhere, had known this pain before, had survived it, had marked it, and left something behind. In the end, charms weren't about magic. They were about memory, about rhythm, about hope, dressed in small, tangible forms. A whisper, a thread, a bundle, a shape. something to believe in when belief was all that kept the breath moving. The girl began to whisper too, not always, but when it mattered, and the whispers weren't for the mother, they were for the silence between contractions, the space where fear gathered, the place where life might or might not decide to stay. That space needed sound, and sometimes a whisper was enough to fill it. There was a line, silent, invisible, that marked the boundary between the ordinary world and the place where birth began. Not a line you stepped over lightly, not a line you noticed, unless you'd crossed it too many times to count. The midwife knew that line. It started with a knock. Then came the hush, the tight faces, the way someone always looked down when they opened the door. She started, they'd say, or it's time, and that was all. From there, everything changed. The house might be the same. Low roof, stone floor, smell of smoke and boiled roots. But once the midwife crossed that threshold, it was no longer a house. It was a chamber, a liminal space, a sealed circle of breath, pain, silence, and motion. Birth didn't begin with pain, it began with preparation. Someone had already cleared the space. Someone had spread rushes, drawn shutters, removed sharp tools from sight, laid linens over the bench. The mother waited somewhere beyond, sometimes seated, sometimes pacing, sometimes curled into herself like the pressure had already begun to fold her inward. And the midwife would pause, not long, just a breath, at the threshold, not to pray, not always, but to recognize the shift. You did not walk into a birth chamber the same way you walked into market or church. You entered like someone stepping between worlds. The girl didn't understand this at first. On her third or fourth birth, she'd marched straight into the cottage, bag in hand, voice clear. "I'm here." The mother moaned, the father flinched, and the midwife touched her arm and said only, "Try again." So the girl stepped out, waited, and walked back in slower. No words, just presence. After that, the room changed. Or maybe she did. The birth chamber had rules, most of them unspoken. No iron tools left visible, no mirrors uncovered, no speaking the names of the dead, no counting out loud of pains, of pushes, of prayers. Some rooms had charms tucked into corners, knotted straw, dried fennel, a shoe turned backwards beneath the bed. Some had saints painted on cracked plaster, eyes faded, hands lifted. The midwife never disturbed them. Belief, even borrowed, had weight, but she brought her own rules too. She checked the water basin, checked the fire. Was it low enough not to overheat the room? High enough to warm the cloths? Checked the floor. Would her knees hold up if she knelt there for hours? She asked for space. Not always with words. A look was enough. The chamber had to contract, just like the body. It had to focus. Too many people, too much noise, and everything slowed, and slowing was dangerous. The mother's position varied. Some sat, some stood, some swayed like trees in wind. Some begged for help before anything had begun. Some refused help even as blood ran down their thighs. The midwife didn't judge either kind. She listened to the breath, to the silences between gasps, to the tension in the hands, the curl of the toes, the shifting of the eyes. And she adjusted. She adjusted the lighting. Too bright and fear rose. Too dim and danger hid. She adjusted the temperature, opened a shutter, dampened the fire. She adjusted herself, because the chamber had no use for ego, only attention. The girl once asked, "Why does it feel different in there?" The midwife answered, "Because life hasn't made up its mind yet. The threshold wasn't just a door, it was the space between what was and what might be." Not all who entered left whole. Some didn't leave at all. But while they were in that space, while the work was happening, it was the midwife's job to hold the border, to keep out panic, to keep in heat, to hold the woman, sometimes literally, sometimes not, until the moment passed. Because it always passed. Even when it felt like it never would, there were tools, laid out in the same order every time. Cloth, knife, cord, oil, not for convenience, for rhythm. The body had rhythm, and the tools did too. If one was missing, the midwife felt it like a skipped beat. She didn't reach for the knife until she'd touched the oil, didn't cut the cord until the cloth was ready, didn't speak the name until the child cried. There was a method, but more than that there was respect, because this wasn't a job. It was a ritual carried out in wood-smoke silence, broken only by breath and pain, and the small, stubborn sounds of life insisting on itself. The father, if he was present, usually stood outside the threshold, sometimes pacing, sometimes praying, sometimes just still. They weren't unwelcome, but they weren't helpful either. The birth chamber belonged to the women, and to the child, and to whatever watched from the corners, whether that be spirits, saints, or simply the weight of generations. Once during a long and bitter winter, the midwife had entered a chamber that felt wrong, too cold, too quiet. The mother was ready, but the air was not. She paused. She lit a candle, not for light, for presence. She placed it in the center of the room, watched the flame. It bent once, then steadied. Only then did she say, "We can begin." The child lived, so did the mother, and the candle burned down to a stub that she still carried in her pouch. Not for use, just for remembering. Every chamber had a moment when everything stilled. No screams, no contractions, no motion. The air thick, the sweat cooling, the child not yet emerged, the mother caught between push and collapse. That moment was the threshold within the threshold. It didn't last long, but it left its mark. The midwife had seen eyes lose focus in that pause, had seen hands go limp, had heard whispers, not from her, not from the girl, not from the mother, and then motion returned. The cry, the pull, the breath, and the child came through. But that space remained behind. The girl asked once, "What happens if the moment doesn't pass?" The midwife didn't answer. She just turned and laid out the cloths, and the girl understood. The chamber could not be described to someone who hadn't been inside. It was too raw, too narrow, too wide. It was a place where time bent, where hours passed like minutes, and a minute could stretch across eternity, where sound shifted, where everything you'd prepared could fail, and everything you forgot could save a life. The threshold was not a welcome mat. It was a veil, a warning. The midwife stood there because no one else could. Not the priest, not the lord, not the healer in the town who wrote prescriptions in Latin and never touched blood. Only the midwife, and later the girl who stood with her and waited and crossed. Pain arrived long before the prayers, but the prayers stayed longer. The first cries weren't for God. They were for mothers, sisters, anyone who could carry part of the weight. The kind of cries that bent the spine, cracked the throat, and opened something more ancient than language. Labour was never quiet. Not really. There were groans, gasps, shouted names, broken curses. But prayers, that was a different kind of sound. They came later, when the body had stopped pretending it could resist. When the mother realized no one could take this from her. That's when the prayers started. Not whispered in churches, but blurted into sweat and straw. Fragmented, desperate. Sometimes not even words, just repetitions. Syllables tumbling from lips like breath gone wrong. Ave Maria, Holy Mother, Saint Bridget, help me, help me, help me. The midwife had heard every variation. Some women recited the same line over and over until their voice cracked. Others invented their own invocations, half song, half sob, directed at saints. No one had canonized. The girl had once tried to join in. She thought it would help, thought that echoing the mother's prayer would create some harmony. The midwife shook her head. Let her speak alone, she said. That's her rope to hold. The prayers weren't for the midwives. They weren't even for heaven, really. They were for the woman herself. A way to make the pain smaller by giving it shape, by speaking through it, not around it. And yet the midwife prayed too, quietly, always. Not with words she remembered from Mass, not with doctrine, but with her hands, with her breath, with the ritual of cloth and oil and motion. She knelt with intent. She pressed with mercy. She moved with rhythm. That was prayer too. No incense, no gold, just blood, sweat, heat, and the unspoken plea. Let her live. Some called midwives heretics for that. Said they usurped divine will, meddled where only God should tread. But it was the opposite. The midwife didn't deny God. She simply didn't wait for him to show up. He had plenty of churches. The birth chamber had her, and she believed, maybe more than any priest, that something sacred moved through those rooms. Not clean, not calm, but sacred. One woman years ago had clasped her hands in the middle of a contraction and muttered, through her teeth, "If you love me, God, you'll take me now." The midwife held her up as she shook and whispered, "He loves you too much to let you go that easy." They both laughed, then cried, then pushed. The child lived. So did she. That counted for something. But prayers didn't always save. Some women begged all night, lit candles, promised penance, bargained their next breath, and still the blood didn't stop, and still the child never cried. In those moments the chamber grew heavy. The prayers turned into silence, the kind that stuck to the walls, that clung to the bed frame, that left the midwife's hands shaking as she packed the blood-soaked linens into a bag. There was a prayer for that too, one the midwife never spoke aloud, only mouthed it. Take the pain, leave the woman. Sometimes it worked, often it didn't. The girl asked once, "Do you believe they're heard?" The midwife didn't answer right away. "I think the ones we say for others, they're heard differently." Differently how? She looked up, eyes tired. They echo longer. She didn't explain what that meant. The girl didn't ask again. Not all prayers were cries for mercy. Some were invocations of rage. One mother screamed at heaven for making her womb a battlefield. Another spat St. Margaret's name when the pain tore sideways and the blood came too fast. The saints didn't mind, the midwife said. They'd heard worse. St. Margaret was the one they called on most. Patron of pregnant women, said to have been swallowed by a dragon and lived. A fine metaphor, really. Every labouring woman felt devoured. They had a small wooden token of her, smooth from touch, edges worn, hung on a cord above the birthbed, not always noticed, but never forgotten. The midwife would tap it once with a knuckle, a small sound, then begin. The girl thought it was superstition. Then one day she forgot, and the labour dragged for hours longer than expected. The child was fine. The mother bled. She never forgot again. There was a rhythm to the prayers. 3 deep breaths. 1 exhale with a saint's name. 2 pushes. 1 name. Breathe. Push. Name. Again. Not liturgy. Not magic. Just rhythm. The body liked rhythm. It helped it know what came next. Some mothers made their own patterns, hummed, rocked, clenched a cloth and called it holy. Whatever worked. Whatever made them feel like something in the universe had their back. In the end, that's all prayer was. The belief that someone or something was listening. Even if that something was just the air, or the child, or the blood itself. And sometimes it was the midwife. She listened harder than anyone, tracked every syllable, every pause, every place the voice dipped or surged. That was part of her prayer too. Listening with her whole body, responding only when needed, letting the woman find her own way through. There was one prayer the midwife never allowed in the chamber. Let it be over. She said it invited defeat, invited surrender, and surrender could turn a moment's exhaustion into tragedy. She told the girl to replace it with another. Let me see the end. That was different. Seeing the end meant believing it would come, eventually, even if you had to crawl through blood and fire to reach it. The girl didn't understand that difference until her 5th birth. The woman had been labouring for 2 days, her breath ragged, her eyes unfocused, and then she whispered, "Let it be over." The girl flinched, remembered the warning, so she bent low, brushed hair from the woman's brow, and said, "You will see the end. I swear it." The woman blinked, then nodded, and pushed. Sometimes words mattered more than pressure, more than tinctures, more than clean linen or hot water. The right word, said at the right time, turned pain into purpose. That was the closest thing to grace a midwife ever gave, and when the baby came, slick, silent, unsure, the midwife took her, cradled her, and whispered the first word she ever heard, "Live." That too was a prayer, the smallest one, the strongest. Not to saints, not to heaven, to the child, to the blood, to the world. Live. And when the child wailed, thin, angry, alive, the mother sobbed and pressed her forehead to the midwife's hand. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you, thank you." The midwife just nodded. She'd already begun the next prayer. Let her heal. Let her rest. Let her forget the worst of it, and remember the rest, and may she never need me again. Not soon. Not for this. Only then did she step out of the chamber, into the cold, breathed once, twice, let the sound of the world return, and whispered, for herself alone, "Let me keep doing this. Just one more time, then another, until the last prayer comes, and someone younger knows it too." The chamber didn't smell like holiness. It didn't smell like new life, or soft blankets, or candle wax and hymns. It smelled of labour, of bodies pushed past silence, of sweat, of iron, of blood. But above all, it smelled of rue, that sharp, bitter green, the scent that bit the air even when dried. Midwives burned it, steeped it, crushed it beneath their fingers, until the oils clung to skin, long after the birth was done. Not because it was beautiful, but because it was necessary. Rue was protection, a purifier, a cleanser for the air and the spirit. They said it kept bad humours out, drove illness away, blinded the devil if he dared to watch. The midwife didn't argue. She didn't need to believe all of it. She just needed to know what worked. She burned rue before the cord was cut, always. It made the chamber thick with smoke, layered with the scent of old green and fresh blood. It clung to the linens, to her sleeves, to the girl's hair. Long after the child was swaddled and sleeping, rue lingered. So did the fire. Not just the hearth, though that burned low and steady. Its coals raked, its ash shifted to the side where the compresses warmed. But the other fire, the one in the basin, kindled with dried herbs and resin scraped from the underside of pine bark. The smoke from that fire wasn't thick. It wavered, moved slowly, like a breath drawn through teeth. Frankincense when they had it, pine and sage when they didn't. One spark, then smoke, and the fire carried more than heat. It was memory, ritual and warding all at once. The mother never saw it fully, not really. Her world was narrowed to the bed, to the ache in her hips, to the ache in her throat, to the wet scream in her arms. But she smelled it, and sometimes that was enough. Some midwives lit the birthing fire before labour began. Others waited until the head crowned. This one did both. A small flame at the start, a second when the child came. 2 fires, 2 prayers. The first, let this begin safely. The second, let it end in peace. It wasn't always peaceful. Sometimes the rue burned too fast. Sometimes the herbs smoked thick and dark, and the child cried harder when they inhaled. But it was better than nothing. Better than cold rooms and raw air. Better than silence. The girl asked once why rue when it stung the nose. The midwife answered, because it tells everything else to leave. Everything else. The fever, the fear, the restless spirits that clung to birth beds and whispered to the exhausted. The girl never doubted that last part. Not after the night she saw a labouring mother reach for someone who wasn't there. The fire was lit moments later. The rue burned blue. The mother's eyes cleared. Not proof, but close enough. The midwife's pouch held more than herbs. It held a pinch of salt wrapped in linen. It held ashes from the fire lit on her first solo birth. It held splinters from a tree struck by lightning, because someone once told her that lightning cleared away ghosts. Whether true or not, the story was worth keeping. Rue didn't cure, it didn't stitch or warm or stop bleeding, but it prepared the space. It shifted the weight of the room. It told the body, you are not alone, and in those moments that mattered. There were other herbs too, mugwort to ease cramping, sage for cleansing the air, lavender to calm the mind. But rue was different. Rue was rude, unapologetic, bitter to the core, and that's why it worked. The chamber didn't need sweetness, it needed strength. There were rules to the burning, never after a stillbirth, never if the mother couldn't open her eyes, never if the fire wouldn't catch the first time. These weren't scientific, they were survival, superstition some said, but superstition was just science waiting for proof. And the midwife didn't need proof, she needed results. The fire was also used to scorch tools. A small blade passed through flame, not because it sterilized, though it helped, but because it sealed the moment, because it marked the transition, because it turned something ordinary into something sacred. A knife that had touched flame became part of the birth, and the midwife treated it differently afterward, oiled it, wrapped it, stored it separate. The girl learned this too, not by being told, by watching. That was how most of it passed on, not in books, not in lectures, but in firelight and scent and repetition. The house after birth always carried 2 smells, rue and ash. You could tell if a midwife had done the delivery just by breathing, and you could tell if she had stayed, because if she had, the fire would still be warm, the herbs would still smoulder, the basin would still steam. Even hours later, one woman, an elder, blind in one eye, deaf in one ear, had once said that she knew her daughter would live because she smelled rue the moment she stepped into the house. The air felt closed, she said, like nothing else could get in. That was the point. Not to clean, not to beautify, to seal. The fire sealed the space. The rue sealed the body. The midwife sealed the story. Everything had a place, even pain, even death, but it didn't get to linger unless it was invited. The girl asked, after a long winter birth that ended in silence, whether she should light the fire anyway. The midwife paused, then said, yes, but only for the living. So she did. The room filled with smoke. The baby was gone. The mother barely breathing. But the fire burned, because healing needed a signal, because grief needed direction, because even in loss, something needed to end cleanly. Later, the mother would say the scent helped her sleep for the first time in days. That was enough. Not every chamber had rue. In poor homes it was rare. In noble homes it was replaced with expensive incense. But wherever the midwife went, she carried her own supply, wrapped in waxed cloth, tucked into a pouch that smelled of 50 other herbs, but always let rue come through. The scent marked her. Children recognized her not by face, but by the way she smelled, rue and fire, and the faint fading trace of something scorched. It lingered in her shawls, in her hair, in her hands, and she liked it that way. It meant the work had stayed with her, even when the child did not, even when the name of the mother was forgotten, even when the room had long been cleaned and the ashes scattered. Rue and fire remained, as they always had, and as they would, until the last birth came, and someone else lit the flame, and someone else crushed the bitter leaves, and someone else said, "It's time." Blood didn't mean danger, not always. It meant a body doing what it had to do, breaking to let something through. No child came into the world without blood. Some came with little. Some came with floods. The difference was often the space between a cry and a silence. Midwives watched for that space. Not the scream or the squirm, but the silence that settled after, because if the child cried and the mother didn't, or if both cried and then one went quiet too soon, then it began, the waiting, the wiping, the weighing of how much had left the body before the soul had a chance to stay. The girl had seen it first in winter. A woman pale even before labour began. Thin wrists, quiet eyes, a birth that took too long and ended too fast. The blood came like water tipped from a basin. No scream, just wetness. Everywhere. The midwife didn't speak. She didn't panic. She pressed. She rapped. She called for cloth and heat and prayer. "Press here," she told the girl. "Harder. Don't let go." And the girl pressed. Her knees numb on the floor. Her hands slick and shaking. Her heart louder than the mother's breath. The mother survived. Barely. And the girl never again mistook blood for something symbolic. It was weight. It was warmth. It was time measured in ounces lost. And it required binding. Binding was more than cloth. It was pressure applied with meaning. Speed balanced with care. The wrong pressure tore skin. The right pressure saved it. There were layers to it. First the clean cloth. Then the pressure. Then the band. Then the silence. Watching to see if it held. Some women bled for hours and lived. Some bled a little and didn't. There was no pattern, only response. The midwife carried binding cloths in her pouch, folded a certain way so she could grab them without looking. Some were plain, some marked, threads of red or blue stitched into the edge, so she knew which were for postpartum, which were for stillbirth, which were for sealing the wound when stitching wasn't possible. Stitching was rare, reserved for the worst tears, done with hands steadied by grief, not confidence. Most midwives didn't stitch. The ones who did never bragged. The binding cloth smelled of herbs, rue again, yarrow, comfrey. Not because the herbs worked miracles, but because the scent covered the metallic bite of blood, a kindness. The girl once asked if the cloths could be washed and reused. The midwife stared, then said, only if they failed. Successful cloths were burned. They had served their purpose. No need to tempt fate. Some women brought their own cloths, heirlooms, pieces of wedding gowns, christening linen, woven scraps from a mother long dead. Superstition, maybe, but birth wasn't the place to challenge beliefs. The midwife accepted them all, and burned them if they failed, and buried them if they didn't. Blood meant labour had happened. Binding meant it had been survived. But not every binding was for stopping blood. Some were for closing. The belly, soft and empty, was wrapped to guide it back inward. The hips, sore from strain, were wrapped to hold their shape. Even the chest, sometimes if the milk came late or not at all. And sometimes it wasn't the body that needed binding. It was the grief. The midwife had seen women lose their children before their arms even reached to hold them, seen them turn their faces from light, seen them bite their lips until they bled, just to stay silent. There were no cloths for that, but the midwife wrapped them anyway, in shawls, in arms, in presents. She offered no comfort, only contact. That was binding too, not the stopping of pain, the witnessing of it. Sometimes that was the only thing that worked. One winter, a woman gave birth to twins. One lived, one did not. The living child wouldn't nurse. The mother wouldn't speak. The midwife wrapped her belly, her chest, her wrists, tied knots with deliberate slowness, not to heal, not to save, but to say, "You are still here, you are still whole," and the mother wept, and nursed, and lived. The midwife never said her bindings were holy, but the girl noticed she always washed her hands before and after, as if the act demanded purification. Not every woman accepted binding. Some refused it, some feared it, said it kept the pain inside. The midwife never argued. She let them choose, but she always left the cloth nearby, folded, clean, waiting. The bindings weren't just for the women. The babies were bound too, swaddled so tightly they couldn't move a finger, not for cruelty, but for safety. The body remembered the womb. It needed containment to feel calm. The midwife taught the girl how to wrap without pinching. Snug, not stiff, she said. Firm, not cruel. The wrapping kept warmth in, kept spirits out, kept breath even. Sometimes the cloth was too small. Sometimes it was torn. Didn't matter. The binding had to be done. Not just for the child, for the mother. To see that the body she'd torn open had produced something whole. It mattered, more than most things. In noble houses, bindings were done with silk. In poor cottages, with scraps. But the principle didn't change. Swaddle, wrap, bind. Because the world was cold. Because the world was loud. Because the first kindness any child received was to be held, even if only in linen. The girl learned to bind by watching. Not just hands and folds, but the look on the mother's face when it was done. Relief, sometimes gratitude, sometimes fear, sometimes both. There was one birth in spring, when the child was still. No breath, no sound. The mother too weak to grieve. The The room full of nothing. The midwife bound the child anyway, carefully, lovingly, without a word, then laid him in the cradle, not to pretend he would wake, but because he had existed. That was the last kindness. The cloth, once removed, was buried with him. That was the first vow. The girl remembered it forever. Bindings were not magic. They didn't cure fevers. They didn't mend bones. But they gave the illusion of safety, of boundaries, of care. And sometimes, in the haze of pain and fatigue, that illusion was enough. The midwife kept her binding cloths next to her flint, because both were tools of prevention. Fire stopped rot. Binding stopped blood. Fire kept the house. Binding kept the body. And both had to be used before it was too late. Not all bindings were seen. Some were carried under the skin. A promise not to speak. A decision not to name names. A weight in the chest, knotted tighter after each death. Those were the bindings that never came loose. The midwife bore them. The girl began to feel them too. Not yet unbearable. But there, a slow tightening of understanding. That to deliver life, you had to brush hands with death. And tie it back with whatever you had. She kept them hidden. Not because they were illegal, but because they were powerful. The vials were small, glass if she was lucky, horn if she wasn't. Corked tight, wrapped in scraps of wool, stored in a pouch she wore under her apron, just above the hip bone. A place easily reached in the dark. Each vial held something different. Tinctures, powders, oils. Not labelled, there was no need. The midwife knew their shapes by touch, their contents by scent. A twist of rosemary in one, a drop of vinegar tincture in another. Crushed pennyroyal, a bit of rue suspended in old wine. Nothing grand, nothing noble, but enough to tilt a life forward or back. The girl had asked once, "Are they medicines?" The midwife had paused, then answered, "They're decisions." She never explained what that meant, but over time the girl understood. A vial could speed a labour that had stalled. It could ease a womb that refused to let go. It could calm a scream. It could stop a heart. Not every midwife carried such things. Only the old ones. Only the ones who had stood at too many thresholds. Only the ones who knew that sometimes birth demanded a hand, not just steady, but willing. The vellums came next. They were older still. Not potions, not powders, but knowledge, written in ink long faded. Tiny scraps of vellum, torn from larger scrolls, kept flat between bits of birch bark. Not pages meant for books. Pages meant for hiding. Some were in Latin, some in French. One, oddly, in Greek. The girl couldn't read any of them, but the midwife could. Slowly, painfully, one letter at a time, as if coaxing breath from stone. She didn't read them aloud. That wasn't their purpose. They were reminders, memories wrapped in script. A recipe from Trotula, a diagram of the womb shaped like a pomegranate, a list of prayers meant to be whispered during breech births. They weren't authoritative. They were intimate, written by women, passed to women, read in secret, because no one else thought it worth keeping. The churchmen copied Bibles, the scholars copied laws, the physicians copied Galen and Hippocrates. But the midwives, they copied each other. The girl once watched her mentor press a new velum flat with the back of a spoon, then wrap it in a linen square like it was a relic. "Don't let them rot in the damp," she warned. "They'll rot anyway, but not while you're breathing." No one else cared about the writings. Certainly not the priests. And definitely not the physicians. But the midwife did, because they weren't texts, they were vows. Every velum said the same thing in different ink. We were here, we knew things, we passed them on, and so she did. The girl learned to copy too. Not full texts, her Latin was poor, but sketches, symbols, the shape of a root, the curl of a sleeping child in the womb. She copied what she could, pressed between leaves, dried flat with river stones. Her hands weren't steady, not yet. But they would be. The vials and the velums made her a midwife, yes, but it was the vows that made her dangerous. Not vows to the church, not to the guilds or the law, vows to the women, simple ones. "I will not leave you. I will not forget your name. I will carry what you cannot." And she did. In silence, in secrecy, in the pressure of her palms against a softening belly, in the memory of screams, in the blood that never fully left her fingernails. These were not vows spoken in ceremony. They were made in the moment, and they stayed. There was one vow she never made. "I will save you," because she couldn't. Not always, not even often. Saving wasn't the point. Witnessing was, and if a midwife could do both, then that was grace. The girl learnt that too. In spring, a mother delivered a breech baby in a hut that smelled of rot. The child died. The mother lived. Barely. Afterward, the girl lit the fire, cleaned the cloths, burned the herbs, and then, when the mother asked, "Why did you come?" she had no answer. She just said, "Because I said I would," and the mother nodded and closed her eyes and slept. That was the vow. Not miracles, not answers. Presence. Always presence. The vials were useful, yes, the vilums. Meaningful. But it was the vow that turned a woman into a midwife. It couldn't be taught, only chosen, and kept. The girl had not made hers yet, not officially. The midwife waited. She would know when the time came. It wasn't marked by success. Not a clean birth. Not a grateful mother. Not a healthy child. It was marked by loss. The moment she stayed after everything went wrong. When she cleaned the body. When she whispered to the blood. When she kissed the hand of a woman who never woke up and still came back the next day to do it all again. That was when the vow was made, and it stayed. The midwife had lost count of how many she'd made. They lived in her bones now, in the slope of her back, in the steadiness of her hands, in the silence between breaths. When she died, the girl would inherit the pouch. The vials dried out. The vilums cracked. The vows invisible, but still there. All of them. That was how it worked. Not by schooling, not by license, but by inheritance of trust. The physicians didn't understand that. They would soon arrive, pressing at the edges of her world. They came with their own vials, their own vials, their own vows to science, to institutions, to hierarchies of knowledge. They came with learning, but not always with listening. And that, the midwife feared, would be the difference that mattered. The girl did not yet know how fast the world was changing, how soon the knock would come, how sharp the edge of parchment could be when it was used to cut away everything you knew. But she would, soon. The vials, the velums, and the vows would be questioned. Their usefulness, their origin, their danger, and the midwife would not be able to stop it. She could only prepare the girl, one vial at a time, one page at a time, one promise at a time. So when the door finally opened, and the physician stepped in with his polished shoes and sealed papers and look of quiet disdain, the girl would be ready, not to fight, but to stand, with her pouch hidden, her notes copied, and her vow unbroken. The first time a physician came to the birth room, he knocked. Not politely, not humbly, just loudly enough to remind everyone that he had arrived, and that his arrival meant authority. The midwife didn't move to open the door. She looked at the girl. The girl looked at the labouring mother, and the mother said nothing, her face contorted, her hands gripped tight around soaked linens. The knock came again, then silence, then the creak of a door uninvited. He stepped in without waiting, not out of rudeness necessarily, but because he believed his presence was reason enough. He was young, neatly dressed, a trimmed beard, a clean collar, boots that had never seen mud, in one hand a leather bag, in the other parchment with red ribbon, seals, authority, the weight of approval from institutions far removed from blood and screaming. He said he was here to ensure no unorthodox methods were being used. The girl's hands, which had just wrapped a bandage around the mother's thigh, tensed. Unorthodox, everything in the room was unorthodox to him. The burning herbs, the quiet prayers, the positioning of the mother upright, gripping rope, not lying flat like some lifeless specimen. The midwife stood between him and the bed. "Your presence isn't needed," she said. He raised an eyebrow. "It's not for you to decide." "No," she said, "it's for her," and she turned to the mother. Between groans, the mother managed a nod, a small, sharp gesture, but it was enough. The physician exhaled sharply, folded his arms. He didn't leave. He stayed in the corner, watching, saying nothing, touching nothing. The midwife didn't look at him again, not until the birth was done, not until the child cried, not until the mother's breath slowed, and the fire in the basin guttered low. Then she turned. "You've witnessed it," she said. "Go write about it." He didn't answer. He left. That was the beginning. After that, the knock came more often. Sometimes it was the town physician, sometimes a student, sometimes a church-sponsored healer sent to observe and report. They all looked the same, clean, curious, slightly uneasy around fluids. Their hands were soft, their voices clipped, their minds cluttered with theory. They spoke of wombs as vessels, of fluids as imbalances, of pain as divine punishment. They rarely listened. The girl asked once, "Why don't they try to help?" The midwife shrugged, because they were taught to fix bodies, not to stand with them. The physicians brought tools, forceps, speculums, blades of uncertain sharpness. They brought mixtures laced with opium. They brought diagrams, charts, confidence. But they didn't bring presence, not the kind that mattered, the kind that knelt beside a woman, that held her hand through the scream, that wiped blood from her thighs without flinching, that lit the rue not for effect but for belief. The physicians didn't understand belief. They understood symptoms. And sometimes they got it right. A poultice for infection, a tincture for fever, a salve for tearing. They weren't useless, just incomplete. The midwife didn't hate them, she feared them, not for what they were, but for what they were becoming, because every time they knocked, they took a little more. First it was observation, then it was permission, then it was oversight. Soon a midwife needed written approval to assist a noble birth, then a license, then a male sponsor, then a physician on hand, just in case. And then, before she realised it, her own name meant less than the seal on a piece of parchment. The girl saw the shift in real time. One summer, a magistrate's wife went into labour. The midwife was summoned. She arrived with her kit, her cloths, her vials. At the door she was stopped. "We've already sent for the physician," said the steward. "You may assist him if he allows it." She stood there, lips tight, not angry, not surprised, just tired. When she entered the chamber, the physician was already there. He was kneeling, not to help, but to retrieve something he'd dropped. He stood when he saw her, smiled faintly. "Ah, the traditional hand." She nodded. She said nothing. She watched as he measured the mother's pulse with one hand, while flipping through a folded page with the other. Watched as he prescribed rest, warmth and water. 3 things already being done. When the labour slowed, he frowned, reached for a tool. The midwife stepped forward, quietly, offered a different position, lifted the mother's legs, shifted the pressure. And within minutes, the child came. The physician blinked, then cleared his throat. "Well then," he said, adjusting his collar, a smooth delivery. He signed the parchment. She cleaned the blood. Only one name was written. The girl asked later if it hurt. The midwife smiled. Only the first 100 times. And then came the talk of regulation. Midwives must be supervised. Midwives must be taught by approved physicians. Midwives must refrain from using herbs deemed superstitious. Midwives must submit names, methods, records. The midwife didn't write names. She remembered faces, gripped hands, counted breaths. But she did not write names. It wasn't about secrecy. It was about protection. Not every woman could afford to have her choices recorded. Not every birth was wanted by law. The physicians didn't care. They cared about numbers, outcomes, mortality rates. They didn't ask why some mothers didn't want their husbands in the room, or why the midwife came through the back door, or why some births ended with a burial by moonlight. They saw disorder. The midwife saw stories, and slowly those stories were being erased. The girl began to write them down, not for the physicians, for herself. Notes tucked under her pillow, sketches of positions, memories of cries, because the knock would keep coming, and one day they wouldn't ask permission, they'd take it. The midwife prepared her. "Let them come," she said, "but don't let them take what you know." "What if they call it witchcraft?" the girl asked. The midwife looked at the fire, at the herbs hanging above the hearth, at the pouch resting near her hip. Then they've already misunderstood, and in the distance, another knock, not at the door yet, but getting closer. She didn't call herself a witch. None of them did. That name came from other mouths, sharp, dry ones behind pulpit and bench. It was not a name worn, it was a name thrown. Still, it clung, like smoke, like suspicion, like a question no one dared to ask aloud, but everyone whispered as they passed her cottage. The midwife had herbs drying above the hearth, bones strung near the door to keep foxes away, a charm buried beneath the threshold for luck, a Bible on one shelf, a velum tucked into the folds of her mattress. And once, years ago, a girl she could not save, a girl they said had been cursed by her hands. That was enough. That would always be enough. Because midwifery stood at a crossroads, not just of life and death, but of medicine and magic, of faith and fear, of womanhood and power. She didn't wear robes, she didn't chant over cauldrons, she didn't summon storms or fly through windows, but she knew what herbs to steep to bring bleeding, what oils might still a child that refused to turn, what words calmed a woman screaming in a bed of straw, alone in the dark. She knew how to see pain and sit beside it, and in a world governed by men, that kind of knowledge looked suspicious. The girl had heard the stories before she ever saw the faces. Women burned for less, a whisper of a charm, a stillbirth blamed on a demonic touch, a sick cow following a glance from the wrong widow. The church was louder now, sharper, and the midwife, once respected as a necessary hand in dark places, was now being watched more than welcomed. "She uses root work," one cleric had muttered during a parish visit. "She doesn't report every death," said another. "She buries things in her garden," and each observation, no matter how small, was another step down a path that forked into fire. The girl asked, once, "Are we witches?" The midwife looked tired. "No, will they think we are?" "Eventually." it wasn't always this way. In older times, midwives walked freely between fields and manors, between church steps and back alleys. They were known, trusted, feared perhaps, but welcomed. They had names, not titles, neighbours, not informants. But then came the manuals, the books with diagrams of devils nursing from women's breasts, the treatises written by men who had never delivered a child, but could pen 1,000 words on what evil lurked beneath a woman's skirt. The physicians brought papers, the priests brought sermons, both brought the witch. She became an answer to every discomfort. A difficult birth? Witch. A malformed child? Witch. A hemorrhage? Witch. A husband's jealousy? Witch. And if the midwife was present, if she had spoken boldly or stood too long by the fire, or uttered words not in Latin, then the line was drawn. 1 foot in care, 1 foot in crime. Even the tools betrayed her. The birthing stool looked too much like a throne, the binding cloths too much like relics, the charms for easing pain too much like invocation. It didn't matter that the midwife baptized the stillborn, whispered psalms when the mother couldn't breathe, or crossed herself before every birth. Faith in her hands didn't count, only fear did. In one village, a midwife was dragged from her home for speaking with the dead. The truth, she'd been whispering to a stillborn child before wrapping it for burial. In another, a woman was hanged for brewing tea that caused miscarriage. The truth, the girl was 13, starving and desperate. The midwife had heard them all and stayed silent, because silence had become the safest vow. The girl noticed she had begun to hide things, herbs tucked deeper behind the beams, vials sealed and buried beneath the ashbin. Even the velums, once displayed with pride, now folded into cracked floorboards. What happens if they come, the girl asked. They already have, said the midwife. It wasn't about being guilty, it was about being visible, and the midwife had spent too long in rooms full of blood and screams to play innocent. She would not deny what she knew, but she would protect it. One day a stranger arrived, a friar, thin, polite, and soft-spoken. He said he wanted to understand the ways of women, so I might counsel them better, he said. He stayed 3 days, watched everything, said little. On the 4th morning, he left a coin on the table and walked away. 2 weeks later, the summons came. An inquiry. Ecclesiastical court. Allegations of unlicensed rituals and improper burial. The midwife didn't blink. Did he lie? The girl asked. No, said the midwife. He just saw what he didn't understand. The trial would not be in a courtroom. It would be in a chapel. Wooden benches, high windows, a priest with ink-stained hands, and a ledger ready to receive names. They would ask questions she could not answer. Why did you burn the cloth? Why did you speak over the stillborn? Why do you keep no records? Why do you not defer to men? And no matter her replies, the room would tilt in the same direction. She was a woman. She had knowledge. She acted alone. That was the formula. The girl asked if she would go. The midwife nodded. It's better to walk toward the fire than to be dragged to it. The girl didn't understand. Not yet. But she would. Soon. Because crossroads didn't last forever. Eventually, you had to choose, stand your ground and be named, or step back and vanish. The midwife chose to stand, not because she wanted to fight, but because she didn't know how to disappear. The girl watched her prepare, not with armor, but with memory. She sat by the hearth, copied names, births, deaths, not dates, but stories. A woman who bled but lived, a child born feet first who screamed louder than any other, a noble girl hidden for months, delivered under moonlight, now a mother herself. The midwife wrote them down, folded the paper, pressed it into the girl's palm. In case I don't return, she said. The girl shook her head. You will. The midwife smiled. Then you'll read it to me. And in the distance, the bell rang. Not for birth, not for death, for judgment. She rose, not slowly, not quickly, just steadily, and walked into the noise. The court smelled of wax and damp wood. Not justice, not even incense, just the heaviness of too many hours and too little air. It wasn't a grand hall, not marble columns or roaring judges, just a chapel turned courtroom, because nothing judged more swiftly than a place built for worship. The midwife stood beneath the gaze of saints painted in flaking gold. They stared down with empty eyes and faded halos, their mouths forever sealed in solemnity. She didn't look up, she looked at the priest. He sat at a long table, surrounded by ink pots and parchment. His hands were clean, his sleeves too white for a place so used to blood. He was younger than she expected. Younger than her. That made it worse. He cleared his throat and asked her to speak her name. She did. Then came the oath, not hers, his, a vow that the court served the church, that its goal was truth and spiritual protection, that this wasn't punishment, just inquiry. The words were recited with the calm detachment of someone who had never watched a woman die in childbirth. Then he asked her to swear Do you swear, in the presence of God, to speak truthfully, without deceit, and without keeping hidden what ought be confessed?" She didn't flinch, but the girl, watching from the corner, did, because the midwife had taught her that oaths meant something. An oath wasn't just words, it was weight. You didn't make one unless you were willing to carry it. The priest's oath had been a ribbon, hers would be an anchor. She spoke the words, then waited. He began with the records. "You assisted in the birth of Anna, wife of Robert, the Thatcher? Yes. Was there any sacrament administered? There was prayer. And the child? Stillborn. No baptism? There was no breath." He frowned, dipped his pen, wrote slowly, and so it continued. A long list of names, mostly women. Some known, others only half remembered. Each was a question. Did you use herbs? Did you speak charms? Did you act without a physician? Did you bury the afterbirth? Did you touch the child before the priest arrived? Each was an accusation in disguise. The midwife answered calmly, honestly, but not fully, because the truth didn't live in these questions. The truth was in the way a woman screamed when the child crowned sideways, in the blood that refused to stop, in the nights spent kneeling beside a body cooling by inches, in the silence of a mother who could no longer cry. None of that fit on parchment, so she gave them only what they could hold, and still it wasn't enough. The priest leaned forward. "You have not been licensed by the medical faculty in the city, nor registered with the bishop's list of approved healers." She nodded. "True. You operate without oversight. I operate where oversight does not reach. And you've used rituals, herbs, symbols, words not found in scripture." She met his gaze. "They are not for scripture. They are for suffering." A pause. Ink scratched across vellum. "And yet you claim your work is holy." "I don't claim that," she said. "I live it." The girl watched as the priest's lips tightened. He had expected fear, or repentance, or at least a crack in the voice. But the midwife gave him none, not because she was proud, but because she had made her peace long ago. This wasn't the first time she had stood in front of men who wished to translate her life into ink. It wouldn't be the last. He shifted tactics. "Do you believe your hands have power?" She raised them, palms out, scars visible. "They have skill," he pressed. "Do you believe your words have power?" She nodded. "They comfort." "Do you believe you have ever acted in defiance of the church?" "No," she said. "But the church may have acted in defiance of the living." That did it. The clerk beside the priest stopped writing, looked up. The air thickened. The girl held her breath, but the priest only sighed and closed the book. He did not pronounce judgment. He did not call for penance. He did not bless her or condemn her. He just said, "You may go," and turned away. It wasn't mercy, it was weariness. The church had bigger enemies. Wars, heresies, kings who taxed too heavily. One midwife with cracked hands and a pouch of herbs wasn't worth a fire. Not yet. She left the court as she had entered it, silent, steady, unchanged. But the girl noticed her pause just outside the door. For a moment she looked up at the sky, at the clouds moving past the chapel spire, and she didn't smile, just nodded, as if agreeing with something only she could hear. Later, by the hearth, the girl asked her what she had sworn. The midwife stirred the pot, didn't answer right away, then said, "I swore to tell the truth." "And did you?" "I told the part that belonged to them. And the rest?" She placed a hand on the girl's shoulder. "That part belongs to you." The girl understood then what the oath really meant. It wasn't just survival, it was succession. The passing down of what could not be written, judged, or licensed. What could only be remembered and lived. The church would not forget the midwife, but neither would the women. And in back rooms over water basins and straw mats, in whispers and hums and prayers without saints, her name would pass. Not as witch, not as heretic, not even as healer, but as woman, who stayed, who held, who remembered. She never worked alone. That was the first myth to go. The image of a lone midwife, bent and mysterious, slipping through alleys with a pouch of herbs and a whispered prayer, made for a good tale. But it wasn't true. Midwifery, for all its solitude, was never solitary. There were others, always others. Women who walked beside her through dawn fogs and across frozen paths. Women who lit fires in strange kitchens, held lanterns at odd angles, boiled water without being asked. Women who knew when to speak and when to sit still, who knew that a scream didn't always mean danger and silence didn't always mean peace. They weren't all midwives, not officially. Some were apprentices. Some were widows who had seen too much. Some were herbalists. Some were simply mothers who had birthed enough to know the shape of fear. Together they formed a network, not mapped, not named, but as real as any road or river. It stretched from cottage to village, from one woman's memory to another's mouth. a path paved in shared stories and past knowledge, never written, rarely spoken aloud, but understood. The midwife called it the underthread, invisible but strong, woven beneath the visible world, holding everything together. You couldn't find it on a scroll, but you could feel it in the way one woman sent word ahead. She's coming, be ready. Or how another offered her own bed without hesitation when labour came too early. It was not about titles, it was about trust. No one asked for credentials. They looked at your hands. Were they steady? Were they clean? Did they tremble when the blood came? If not, then you were welcome. The girl first noticed it during a hard winter. They'd been called to a farmhouse nearly swallowed by snow. The mother was young. Her first child had come breech and dead. This one was slow, too slow. The midwife worked in near silence, the cold creeping into her joints. Then, without being summoned, a woman from the neighbouring farm arrived. She brought broth, extra linens, a balm for swelling. She didn't speak. She placed the pot near the fire, wrapped the girl's hands in wool, and disappeared before the baby crowned. When the girl asked who she was, the midwife just said, "She's one of us." That was how it worked. No banners, no oaths spoken aloud, just presence. And yet there were signs, small ones. A sprig of vervain tied to a doorpost, a blue thread looped around a wrist, a certain knot in the apron string, an herb laid upside down in the window. They weren't spells, they were signals. To say, "I see you, I know what you carry, you are not alone." It wasn't always safe. Women who carried too much knowledge too openly were marked, sometimes questioned, sometimes worse. But in places where the law didn't reach, where the roads were too muddy and the priests too far, these women were everything. They didn't always like each other. There were arguments over methods, over herbs, over names. But when the time came, when blood ran too fast or the cries stopped too soon, they stood shoulder to shoulder, not to perform miracles, but to hold space, together. The girl met more of them as time went on, a healer in a port town who swore by garlic and salt, a blind woman in the hills who could predict labour by touch alone, a grandmother with missing teeth, and a laugh like gravel who used only spit and whispered lullabies. They were strange, wise, funny, scary. They contradicted each other constantly, but they all shared the same eyes, the kind that didn't flinch, the kind that had seen birth and death and everything between and come out the other side, not unscarred but unbroken. Some of them had been midwives once, others had lost too much to continue, but all of them remembered, and remembering, that was part of the work, because memory was survival, not in grand histories, but in the minute details. How to turn a child with one hand while soothing the mother with the other, how to boil oak bark just long enough to thicken the blood, how to recognize the difference between a woman's fear and a woman's knowing. These things weren't written down, they were passed, hand to hand, bowl to bowl, from one trembling voice to another. The girl began to listen differently, not just to the midwife, but to all of them. She asked fewer questions, watched more closely, started keeping notes, not in Latin, not in script, but in symbols and sketches, a shorthand only she understood. She learned that the network wasn't made of agreement, it was made of resilience. One woman burned, another took her tools, one woman exiled, another filled her place. One village closed its doors, another opened them wider. No center, no leader, just a thread, woven beneath everything, and through it, a quiet vow that birth would not belong only to men with parchment, that pain would not be answered only by doctrine, that women would not be left to suffer in silence. The midwife once said, "If they silence one of us, another will hum," and the girl had heard that hum, beneath the chants, beneath the prayers, beneath the silence of empty rooms. It was always there. It wasn't loud, it didn't need to be, because it didn't speak to power, it spoke to persistence, and in that, it was louder than anything the court could pronounce. The girl knew now that she was part of it, not just because she had learned, but because she had endured, and one day she would pass it on, not through teaching, but through showing up, through walking into another woman's fear and saying, "I'm here," no robes, no badge, just hands, and memory, and a thread she would never let break. There was a difference between birthing in a cottage and birthing in a castle. Everyone knew it, but no one said it aloud. Not because it was shameful, but because it was simply the way the world was. In one room, a girl pushed on straw, gripping a rag between her teeth to muffle the sound. In another, a lady reclined on silk, her cries carefully tended by whispers and gloves. The pain was the same, but how it was treated, that depended on what you were born into. The midwife had served both. She had knelt beside hearths where the only warmth came from boiling water. She had been summoned to towers where windows opened onto rose gardens and servants stood in silence. And though the titles differed, Lady, maiden, wench, wife, every woman met the same edge. When the child crowned, she was not her name, not her rank, not her wealth. She was just flesh and breath and fear. But still, births were not equal. In noble households, the midwife had to enter through the side. She had to bow, had to speak softly and wait for permission before placing her hands. Physicians stood close, clerics hovered, and the wet nurse had already been chosen, sometimes before the mother even knew she was expecting. A successful birth was a political event. A boy meant succession, a girl meant alliance, a death meant risk, a stillborn meant rumour, and the midwife, she bore the burden of every outcome. In one estate, the child came early, too small, too quiet. The lady, barely conscious, asked if it lived. The midwife hesitated, then said yes. She lied, not to protect herself, but to give the mother one breath of peace before the grief returned. She was dismissed by evening. They said she had acted without reverence, that she had used unfamiliar oils, that she had upset the humours. She was never called back. But in the village, word spread. She held her, they said. She stayed until morning. She named the child when no one else would. And so the thread held. In the peasant cottages, things were different. Not easier, just clearer. There were no physicians, no velvet-lined bassinets, no hired wet nurses. There was pain, prayer, and hope. A hope more fragile because it had fewer layers to protect it. The midwife knew the faces. The girl who hid her pregnancy until the labour began in a barn. The widow who begged the midwife to come quietly, lest the neighbours gossip. The 12-year-old who didn't yet understand what her body had done. There was no ceremony, only necessity. And in that necessity, there was something sacred, a dignity unspoken, a courage not dressed in silk. The midwife had caught babies born between rows of drying fish, in fields, beneath cloaks, in back rooms with doors barred tight against the world. And she never flinched, because here, every child mattered, not for legacy, not for name, but because it had arrived, because it had survived, or even because it hadn't. She remembered one boy, born breech, silent. The mother wrapped him in a cloth she had embroidered herself, months earlier when she still smiled. The midwife watched her place the bundle in a wooden box. No one else came, no priest, no record, just her, and the soil, and the sound of rain on a roof not quite sealed. There were no elegies, just a hand on the mother's shoulder, and a memory the midwife carried longer than she ever meant to. She didn't compare the noble births to the poor ones. Not really. They were different languages of the same truth. That bringing life into the world was never a small thing. But what angered her, what stayed with her more than any pain, was the way that difference began to harden. How midwives were praised in poor quarters but distrusted in noble ones. How a woman's scream was seen as natural in a cottage but embarrassing in a castle. How gold could buy silence while the poor had only song. And how, more and more, the noble births were being taken over by physicians, by men, by instruments that promised precision but understood nothing of fear. She had once been called to a lord's estate, not to deliver, but to witness. The physician led the process. He asked her to step back, to hold towels, to observe. She did. She watched him make a wrong turn, apply pressure too early, use a tool with more metal than mercy. The baby was stillborn. The lady bled for hours. When it was done, the physician turned to her and said, "It is unfortunate." She said nothing, but in her mind she screamed, because she had known, because she could have helped, because no one had asked her to. The girl, now older, asked her what she hated most. The midwife didn't hesitate, not being seen, and yet she kept going, because in the poorest homes she was still wanted, still trusted, still called wise woman, not suspicion. And in those homes the hopes were louder. A boy born to a washerwoman could change a lineage. A girl born to a stable hand could become a healer. A child born after 3 losses could restore faith to a mother who had nearly stopped praying. These hopes weren't recorded. They weren't stitched into tapestries, but they were real, and the midwife carried them all. One in each line on her hand, one in each scar on her back, one in every name she whispered during cold walks home. The girl understood now why the midwife never stayed long in the noble houses, why her eyes always drifted toward the fields, toward chimneys without chiming bells, because that's where her work lived, not in the echo of titles, but in the hush of the hungry, the forgotten, the brave. They didn't all make it. That truth sat in the quiet corners of every cottage, every manor, every road the midwife ever walked. The ones who didn't survive, the mothers, the infants, sometimes both, were not tallied in books. They were not mourned with marble or remembered in hymn, but she carried them, every one of them. They lived in her hands, in the way she paused before a certain threshold, in the hush she held when tying her apron, in the gentleness that wasn't softness but a rehearsed defense against memory. Because when you delivered enough lives, you also learned to bury them. There was a hill, not far from the village. The grass never quite grew straight. Too many burials in too few years. No stones marked the rows, only wooden posts, smoothed by time, and the echo of names few remembered to speak aloud. The midwife went there sometimes, alone, with no tools, no pouch, no companion. She brought silence, and sometimes bread, for the birds. She said it helped to feed something living. The girl once asked why she never cried when a child died. The midwife had blinked, slow and deliberate, because if I start, I might never stop. It wasn't that she didn't feel it, she just didn't display it. Grief was a private tool, like a pair of scissors or a prayer for stillbirths. Kept wrapped, used carefully, never loaned out. But the weight of the dead, it gathered. They came back in dreams. A boy who never cried. A girl who opened her eyes once, then never again. A woman who whispered thank you before slipping away with her baby still inside. Some days the midwife could still feel their warmth in her palms. Other days, only the absence. Not every death was tragic. Some were expected. A mother too malnourished. A child too early. A body too broken by life to welcome another one inside. Still, expected didn't mean easy. Each time it happened, something shifted. The room changed. The air thinned. Time bent strangely, long and slow and yet too quick. And then, silence. Not peace, not sleep, but the silence of breath that would not return. The midwife knew how to prepare a body, how to wash it gently, how to wrap it, how to close the eyes if they didn't close themselves. She knew how to cradle the baby that never cried, how to hold it just long enough, how to place it into the mother's arms, or not, depending on the hour and the look on her face. Sometimes she sang, not for the dead, for herself. A single note, a wordless hum, a thread of sound that helped her move her hands through what came next. She remembered one winter, cold beyond reason, a mother and child, gone within minutes of each other. No family, no priest, no help, just her and the girl, a spade, and a sky that didn't break for days. They buried them beneath a tree. The roots ran deep, the soil reluctantly soft beneath the snow. The midwife said nothing, just placed a dried sprig of yarrow above the grave. The girl asked if they'd be remembered. By us, the midwife said. That's enough. And it was. Because remembrance was not always ceremony. Sometimes it was repetition. Boiling water the same way, in the same pot. Using a lullaby from a voice that no longer spoke. Tying the birthing cloth with a knot passed down by someone no one mentioned anymore. Memory became ritual. Ritual became survival. The church offered mass for the dead. The village offered gossip. The state offered nothing. But the midwife, she offered memory. She held funerals in her chest. Brief, quiet things. A glance at the sky. A hand brushed across a brow. A pause at the threshold before stepping out into the noise again. The girl learned not to ask names. Not to ask stories. Not because they didn't matter. But because sometimes forgetting the name helped remember the feeling. The weight. The silence. The last moment before letting go. The midwife wasn't a priest, but she delivered more souls than most men in robes. Some into the world, some out of it. Either way, she bore witness. That was her truest vow, to be there, to stay when others stepped back, to honour what no one else wanted to hold. She never called herself brave, but she did not flinch. Not when the blood came too fast, not when the scream turned to stillness, not when the question hung in the room. Will they live? And sometimes she said no. Not cruelly, just clearly, because truth in her hands was kinder than hope that had nowhere to land. There was a box she kept, hidden beneath the hearthstone. Inside, scraps. A ribbon, a carved button, a bit of thread, a shard of clay from a cup that broke when a mother's water did. Each one marked a death. She never counted them, but she remembered where each one came from. And sometimes, when the fire burned low and the night was particularly still, she'd lift the stone, take one piece out, and hold it. Not long, just enough to remember that it happened, that someone had existed, that she had been there. The girl, now older, understood the box, understood why the midwife didn't share it. It wasn't about grief, it was about bearing witness without spectacle, about keeping something for the dead that belonged only to them, because even the forgotten deserved a space, even the lost deserved a keeper, and the midwife had made herself that, not through choice, through necessity. There had to be someone, and it was her. It didn't happen all at once. There was no single day when midwives were pushed aside, no trumpet that announced the end of their centuries-long guardianship. It came quietly, slowly, like the changing of a tide, a shift too gradual to notice, until the shoreline looked unfamiliar, and the old paths were drowned. The girl, now grown, saw it begin in things that seemed harmless. A physician sent to observe, a lord's wife asking for a learned man, a new regulation from the town that required written permits to practice birth work. At first the midwife didn't worry. She had survived worse. Courts, accusations, famine, plague. But this was different. This wasn't an attack. It was a rebranding, a reframing of birth, not as a woman's right, but as a medical event. Something clinical, something male. They arrived with instruments, with Latin terms, with diplomas inked in cities far from where any child had ever been born in a barn. They called themselves experts, and they came not to learn but to replace. The old ways, they said, were unclean, the herbs unmeasured, the hands untrained, and the women who practiced them unlicensed, uncontrolled, unreliable. The midwife had heard it before, but this time the accusations were dressed in politeness. No offence, they'd say, but science is moving forward. Forward, a word that had become weaponized. Forward meant away from her, away from warm cloths and whispered prayers, away from touch and memory and songs hummed in dialects that didn't translate well in universities. The girl watched the shift take root. Hospitals built near towns, doctors summoned instead of midwives, women encouraged, no, pressured to lie still and silent, legs bound, pain managed by the same hands that had never held a child before it cried, and when the deaths didn't stop because they never could entirely, they blamed the past, they blamed the women. They did it wrong, they waited too long to call for help, they poisoned with their herbs. The midwife no longer received letters, only rumours, that a woman had bled to death in a clinic, alone, that a child had died beneath a metal tool used inexpertly, that a physician refused to enter a house until payment was secured. The girl saw her teacher begin to withdraw. She still worked, but not as often. The roads she once walked daily grew distant, the requests fewer, the offers more cautious. "You're still allowed for now," someone told her. But things are changing. Allowed. A word that burned worse than any wound. She had caught thousands of children in her lifetime, had saved lives no one remembered to count, had buried others when no one else would, and now she needed permission. She didn't fight it, not openly. She simply kept working, for as long as they let her, until even the poorest homes began to echo with new words: doctor, clinic, sterile. The midwife had never feared medicine. She had feared arrogance, because medicine in the hands of a healer was holy, but in the hands of the indifferent, it was a scalpel without soul, and that was what arrived. More men with clean hands and distant eyes, more rules, more boundaries, less listening. The girl asked if they should resist, if they should push back, organize, demand space. The midwife had only smiled, small, tired. "We are not disappearing," she said. "We are being folded away." And that was true. Midwifery did not vanish. It was pressed between the pages of medical texts, rewritten in margins, sanitized, certified, rendered unfamiliar by language that drained it of its blood and breath. The girl saw it in real time. Tools once carved by women, now patented by men. Herbs once gathered by moonlight, now extracted into pills. Gestures of care transformed into checklists. And still, babies came. Mothers bled. Pain continued. But now the room smelled of alcohol and linen instead of ruined sweat. The hum was gone. The silence was different. Not sacred, just sterile. The midwife aged. Her hands, once strong, began to tremble. She stopped taking calls for births, taught instead when asked. But fewer asked. They wanted textbooks, credentials, a name in a registry. The girl, now a woman, kept learning anyway. She watched both worlds, read the books, held the herbs, listened to both doctors and mothers. She knew something was being lost. Not knowledge, presence. That quiet, steady witness that didn't leave when the charts said normal. That knew how to hold grief without filing it away. That knew when a touch was better than a tool. And the midwife? She did not mourn loudly. She lit her fire. She organized her notes. She cleaned her vials and folded the worn birthing cloths one last time. Then she gave them to the woman, not as inheritance, not as legacy, as continuation. "Don't be loud," she said. "Just stay." And so she did, not in protest, but in persistence, because even as the work faded into male hands, it did not vanish completely. It remained in stories, in stubborn grandmothers who taught their daughters how to listen to a womb, in old books hidden under floorboards, in memories that surfaced at the edge of labour, and in rooms where, despite everything, a woman still reached for another woman when the pain came. They thought it had disappeared. When the midwives were pushed aside, when the herbal remedies were outlawed, when the birth stools were taken to the fire and replaced by hospital beds, there was a belief, subtle but certain, that the old ways had ended. But tradition doesn't need a title to survive. It echoes, not in declarations, but in gestures, in muttered words over boiling water, in charms pinned discreetly inside swaddling cloths, in lullabies whose verses have been forgotten, but whose melodies remain intact. Folk tradition is not history, it is breath, and birth, as one of the most human acts, holds tightly to what breath remembers. The midwife knew this, even as the physicians took over, even as the ledgers excluded her name. She watched her work echo outwards. A village woman who still brewed raspberry leaf when her daughter's time came, a cousin who stitched sigils into her apron, just as she'd seen done when she was a girl, a baker who whispered the same 3 words into the ear of every newborn she met, though she'd forgotten where the words came from. It survived not as defiance, but as instinct. In every culture there were versions, not all called midwife, not all clothed in the same herbs or languages, but in every corner of the world someone kept the memory. Sometimes it looked like ritual, the way a basin was placed just so, the way a rope hung from a ceiling beam, in case the labour pulls too long, the way the windows were opened or shut, depending on the moon. Superstition, the doctors called it. But the women knew better. They didn't believe in magic. They believed in memory, the kind of memory the body carries when the mind no longer knows its source. The girl-turned-woman heard them speak of advancements. She saw charts replace chants. She heard laughter in medical halls about how the peasants once believed garlic could protect a womb. But then, she saw that same garlic hung in the kitchen of a young mother who had never read a single herbal manuscript. No one had told her why. She just felt safer with it there. That was the echo, not loud, but unbroken. In the marketplace, old women still sold bundles of dried mugwort, not for show, not as decoration, but because someone, somewhere, still believed it calmed pain and anchored courage. In the borderlands, midwives who had never called themselves that still kept pouches of ash and salt. In the hills, a shepherd's wife stitched protection knots onto her newborn's bonnet without needing to explain. And in the cities, where everything was supposed to be sterile and rational, there were still women who lit candles during labour, not for the doctors, for themselves, to bring light to the breath between worlds. The woman learned to stop asking where the traditions came from. It didn't matter. What mattered was that they stayed, and they did, even as the names changed, even as the languages shifted, even as birth became a thing of paperwork and machines. There were still echoes. A nurse who stroked a woman's brow and hummed, though she didn't know the tune. A midwife in modern dress who still brought lavender oil and held silence like a prayer. A mother who asked for the same bowl her grandmother had used when labour came. They weren't recreating the past, they were continuing it. Quietly, deliberately, even in places where the tradition had been nearly burned out. It survived in fragments. A piece of cloth, a ritual of boiling water, a recipe remembered only at the edge of sleep. The woman, now called by others for wisdom, didn't try to revive what had been lost. She listened for what had been kept. Because tradition doesn't always look the same when it returns. Sometimes it's not in the object, but in the rhythm. Not in the word, but in the pause. Not in the herb, but in the hand that offers it. That was what she passed on. Not a doctrine, not a syllabus. A way of being, of staying, of holding, of remembering that birth is as much about presence as procedure. And the echoes, she followed them. To remote clinics where old women still blessed the doorframe before a birth. To refugee camps where women who shared no common language still knew what to do when the screaming began. To suburban homes where mothers held hands in a circle because no one else was coming. Folk tradition didn't demand loyalty, it asked only for attention. And in attending to it, the woman saw her teacher's work living on, not as a profession, as a pulse. She once sat beside a scholar who insisted midwifery had largely disappeared during the rise of modern medicine. She didn't argue. She simply said, "Look again." Because the echoes weren't in textbooks, they were in rooms with dim lighting and too many blankets, in the way someone opened a window to let in wind, not because it was hot, but because it felt right. They were in the trembling voice of a first-time mother asking for her own mother's song, in the whispered joke that cut the pain for a moment, in the decision to hold hands, even when no one said to. Tradition wasn't only what was preserved, it was what refused to leave, even when renamed, even when ridiculed, even when rewritten. And birth, it remembered. It didn't care about licenses or titles. It responded to warmth, to steadiness, to the quiet authority of someone who had stood at the threshold before and dared to return. That's what folk tradition is, not the preservation of old ways, but the persistence of wisdom that refuses to vanish. Even now, the woman hears it, in lullabies on city streets, in rituals disguised as routine, in children who grow up calling their mothers friends aunties, because that's what the community demanded. She no longer wonders if the work will survive. She knows it already has. The names are different, the tools are newer, but the thread, that quiet, trembling thread, still runs beneath it all. And as long as that thread exists, the midwife's work continues. Not through fame, not through credit, but through every breath that begins with a whisper and ends with a cry. The house was quiet now. The fires had long since burned down to soft embers. The tools, once laid out with precision and purpose, now rested in drawers no one opened. Dust curled at the edges of old vellum pages. The birth stool, wrapped in linen, sat untouched beneath the staircase. But the silence wasn't empty. It was full of the lives that had passed through this space, full of hands that had worked without applause, full of breaths taken in fear, in pain, in hope, full of the midwife's voice, never loud but always there. Whispers lived in this house, not ghosts, not echoes. Whispers, carried forward not by magic or myth but by memory. The woman, now older than she ever expected to be, moved through the space slowly. She didn't need to tend the hearth anymore. No children would be born here tonight. No herbs needed brewing. No cloth needed folding. But still she moved as if they might. The habit stayed long after the need had gone. In her cupboards were jars with faint labels. Angelica, pennyroyal, rue. Some were empty. Others held just enough to remember their scent. She didn't use them anymore, but she didn't throw them out. Not everything had to be useful to be sacred. She knew her time was nearing its close. There was no fear in that. She had seen too much of life and death to romanticize either. But before she went, before her own breath fell silent, she wanted to be sure the work continued, not the practice, the presence, that quiet art of staying, of witnessing without owning, of helping without binding, of being there when no one else wanted to be. She had trained others, quietly, without ceremony. Young women, older women, women who came not for status, but because they felt pulled by something wordless. Not all stayed, that was all right. The ones who were meant to, did. One wrote down the chants she remembered, translated them for others. Another brought birthwork to a refugee centre, carrying techniques between languages. A third took none of the tools, but all of the tenderness, and applied it to tending the dying. It wasn't about birth, really. It was about thresholds, and those who choose to stand at them. The midwife had stood at many, doorways, gravesides, chambers slick with blood and sweat, courts where her knowledge was questioned by those who had never heard a woman scream, fires where books and bones were burned in the same breath. And yet she endured, not to be a martyr, but because the work needed doing. Even now, in her final days, she heard it. The knock on a door, the hush in a room when the pain began, the look in someone's eyes when they realized what was coming and knew they could not do it alone. She was no longer the one to go, but she knew others would, and that knowing, that quiet trust was enough. Her legacy was not in plaques or parchments. It was in the rhythm of another hand tightening a cloth, in the warmth of another body leaned over in focus, in the steadiness passed down not through bloodlines, but through watching and waiting and doing. She sat once more in the old chair, not because she was tired, though she was, but because it felt right. This was where she had sat when she first learned the trade, where she had watched her own teacher grind herbs with the side of a spoon, where she had folded tiny garments that might never be worn, where she had cried alone after a birth that ended too soon, where she had laughed, truly laughed, when a child took its first breath with a look of defiance. This chair had heard everything. She ran her fingers along its arms, rough, worn, stained in places no one else would notice, but full of truth. She didn't know what the future would hold. Would the old ways disappear completely? Would birth be turned into something entirely clinical, managed from a distance? Would the whispers stop? Maybe, but maybe not, because even as the world moved on, certain things remained. A mother's voice, low and urgent, the feel of a baby turning just before dawn, the weight of knowing when to intervene and when to simply wait. She had taught these things, passed them on in the only way they could truly be passed, by presence, by example, by showing up, again and again, even when the world said her time had passed. She once feared the silence, now she trusted it, because whispers don't need volume. They need patience. They need space. And the world still had those, in rooms where women waited, barefoot and afraid, in refugee tents, where cloth partitions offered more mercy than walls, in houses where the only light came from a single flame, and the oldest stories were told not aloud, but through action. The woman didn't say goodbye. She didn't believe in endings. She believed in continuations, in stories that pause but don't stop, in hands that tremble but still hold, in work that goes quiet but never truly vanishes. And so, when the final moment came, she didn't reach for anyone. She simply closed her eyes and exhaled. And somewhere, not far away, another woman took a step forward, lifted the cloth, lit the candle, and whispered something into the dark that sounded like a beginning.